There are moments in history that don't look like history. They look like nothing. No sirens, no headlines, no bodies in the street. Just a room, a table, and 60 seconds that decide who owns a city, Manhattan. February 1946, a private room near East 53rd Street, the kind of room where deals are whispered, not announced. Lucky Luciano was in the room. Not a myth, not a movie. A real man with real power and a real deadline. His men are standing behind him, hands near their coats, eyes scanning corners like they can smell betrayal. And across the table, Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's numbers king, Harlem's problem, Harlem's gate. Everyone in the room stands when Luciano shifts in his chair. Everyone except Bumpy. Bumpy stays seated, cigar burning, face calm. Like the guns in the room are decorations. One of Luciano's bodyguards takes one step forward. Just one. Bumpy doesn't look at him. Luciano raises a hand slowly. That's when you feel it. That's when the air changes. Because Luciano isn't stopping his man out of kindness. He's stopping him because he knows something dangerous. He knows Bumpy didn't come with muscle. Bumpy came with leverage. And if Luciano makes the wrong move, the wrong man sees it, the wrong rumor escapes this room. New York explodes. Bumpy finally speaks. Quiet, simple, 6 words that make the room freeze. And what happens after those words is why the Italian Mafia never walks into Harlem like an owner again. They don't take Harlem, they negotiate with it. Forever. But to understand how 60 seconds did that, you need to understand the clock Lucky Luciano was racing. February 1946 wasn't just another month. For Lucky Luciano, it was the end of the road, or at least the end of America. He had been moved to Ellis Island for deportation proceedings on February 2nd, 1946, and days later, his ship sailed from Brooklyn on February 10th, 1946. That means one thing. Luciano didn't have time for eventually. No slow wars. No messy takeovers. No bodies that bring heat. He needed a New York stable. Quiet. Profitable. And the Mafia was a machine. A machine needs parts. You can have the docks. You can have unions. You can have trucks and warehouses. But if you don't control cash flow, you're not a boss. You're a man with stories. And in the 1940s, there was one cash river that refused to be rerouted, Harlem. The numbers racket. It wasn't just gambling. The rent money turned into hope. Nickels and dimes stacked into millions, a neighborhood's daily heartbeat. And Harlem didn't trust outsiders. Not then. Not like that. Italian crews had tried to muscle in before, and it ended with gunfire, kidnappings, and more than 40 murders in the Harlem Numbers War era. So Luciano understood the lesson. If you want Harlem, you don't start with a bullet. You start with a table. And the one man who could give Harlem away was the one man Harlem wouldn't give up. Bumpy Johnson, Nas FX footsteps, distant saxophone. People who didn't live there never understood. They heard illegal lottery and pictured a small time. But Harlem numbers weren't small. Numbers were the poor man's dream. One slip of paper, one little bet, one chance to flip a hard week into a new life. And when thousands of people bet every day, that money becomes power. Not just money, power. Because money pays runners. Money pays lawyers. Money pays for protection. Money pays politicians to look away. That's why Dutch Schultz wanted it so badly. Schultz wasn't just greedy. Schultz was strategic. He wanted Harlem because Harlem was a printing press, and Schultz tried to take it with fear. He tried to squeeze the racket, take more, push harder. But even Schultz learned something the hard way. You can't squeeze a community forever. At some point, the community squeezes back. Schultz made enemies everywhere. Then he made one mistake. He challenged the Mafia Commission by trying to go after a prosecutor, Thomas Dewey. The commission refused. Schultz pushed anyway, so the commission ordered him dead. Schultz was shot in Newark in 1935 and died the next day. And after Schultz fell, Harlem didn't become free. Harlem became negotiated, and Bumpy Johnson grew into the man who could negotiate it. He rose under the number Queen Stephanie St. Clair. He learned the difference between fear and respect. Fear breaks people. Respect binds them. And Harlem ran on binding. That's why Bumpy mattered. Not because he was the toughest, because he was the connector, the bridge between street and suit, between church and corner, between money and neighborhood. So when Lucky Luciano's time started running out, he looked north, and he said the words men like him always say, "Bring him to me." The Stork Club at 3 East 53rd Street was one of the most famous Manhattan nightclubs of that era. This is where the powerful went to be seen. Celebrities, socialites, politicians, and behind that glamorous front were private rooms where the real world happened. Now, here's the part most people miss. Luciano wasn't inviting Bumpy to talk. He was staging a test. Because when you control a room, you control a negotiation. So Luciano stacks the room. He doesn't come alone. He brings men who don't smile, men who don't blink, men who look like they've ended conversations permanently. Not because he plans to shoot, because intimidation is a language. And in mafia rooms, intimidation is punctuation. Then Bumpy arrives, and he arrives wrong. He comes without a crew, no wall of muscle, no dozen shooters outside, no loud entrance, just a man in a clean suit, walking like he has the right to be there. That's the second test, because when you enter alone, there's only two possibilities. Either you're stupid or you're certain. Bumpy sits. He doesn't stand for Luciano. He doesn't rush to greet him. He lights his cigar first, and that is when the room tightens. Because it looks like disrespect, but it isn't. It's boundary setting. It's Bumpy saying, without saying, "I didn't come here to beg." Luciano reads it instantly. Luciano doesn't order him to stand. He sits across, and he talks like a man with a ticking clock. Calm, cold. Harlem is the last piece, and I'm leaving America soon. Bumpy doesn't nod. Luciano continues. My people want in. Not all of it. A cut. Then Luciano drops the number. A big number. The kind of number that isn't a request. It's a claim. And the room waits for the reaction. Because this is the moment men usually do one of two things. They accept, or they die proud. But Bumpy doesn't do either. He does something worse. He asks a question. Soft, simple. What happens if I say no? And Luciano answers with the truth. Not angry, not loud, just certain. Then you have a problem. The bodyguards lean forward a fraction. And that's when the story you're about to hear turns on a single moment. Not a gunshot, not a punch, a sentence. Most men in Bumpy's position would reach for a gun, because fear makes men believe the only safety is violence. But Bumpy didn't rule Harlem through fear alone. He ruled through information. And information is a weapon that doesn't make noise. Bumpy takes his cigar out of his mouth, taps ash once. Then he speaks. 6 words. The 6 words from the cold open. The 6 words that made the room freeze. He says, you can't own what trusts me. Silence. Because Luciano understands what that means. It means Harlem doesn't see Bumpy as an outsider. Harlem sees Bumpy as Harlem. And that is a problem guns can't solve. Luciano's man shifts again. Bumpy finally looks up, dead calm. Then Bumpy reaches into his coat, and every man in the room tenses. But it's not a gun. It's paper, a slim folder. Bumpy places it on the table and slides it forward. Luciano doesn't open it immediately. He watches Bumpy's face, because paper can be more dangerous than bullets. Bumpy says, you want to cut. You're not wrong. Harlem prints money, but you're wrong about one thing. Luciano's eyes narrow. Bumpy continues, you think your protection is what I need. No, what I need is stability. That word lands hard, because stability is the one thing Luciano is desperate for before he's forced out of the country. Bumpy taps the folder. This is Harlem stability. Luciano finally opens it. Inside are weekly totals, not exact how-to details, just enough to show scope. There are notes about who collects, who pays, who keeps peace, and on the last page, one line. One line written like a judge's sentence. If Harlem stops paying, New York feels it. Luciano stares, because Luciano knows how machines work. If the cash stops, men panic. Men act stupid. Stupid men start wars, and wars make headlines. Headlines bring politicians. Politicians bring raids, and raids bring prison. Luciano doesn't have time for that. Bumpy leans in. Still quiet. Here's the deal, not your deal. The real deal. The one that keeps the city quiet. Luciano says nothing. Bumpy continues. You don't send collectors into Harlem. Not now. Not ever. You don't patrol my streets. You don't flash your guns like you own the air. He pauses. Then he gives the number. 10%. A low number. Low enough to swallow. High enough to respect. And the room reacts without speaking, because they all understand what's happening. Bumpy isn't refusing Luciano. Bumpy is offering Luciano a win that still keeps Harlem free. Luciano's men want to object, but Luciano doesn't move. He just watches Bumpy like he's seeing a new kind of gangster. Because Bumpy isn't threatening him with violence. He's threatening him with reality. A stalemate, a clean stalemate. And then Bumpy says the final piece, the piece that turns this from negotiation to stand down. He says, and if anyone breaks this rule, Harlem doesn't go to war. Harlem goes quiet. No money, no cooperation, no peace. That's when Luciano understands. If he forces Harlem, he doesn't just fight Bumpy. He fights a neighborhood. And neighborhoods don't fight like crews. They fight like storms. Luciano leans back. He looks around the table. He sees his own men, the killers, the enforcers. And he sees the problem. If he nods now, someone might shoot. And if someone shoots, New York bleeds. Luciano doesn't want blood. He wants his legacy intact before he's shipped to Italy. So Luciano does the only thing that keeps the room from exploding. He smiles. Not a friendly smile, a businessman's smile, the kind that says, you got me, but I respect it. He taps the folder. 10%, he says. Then he adds one sentence, a sentence that changes everything. Harlem stays Harlem. The bodyguards relax a fraction. The air returns. Bumpy doesn't celebrate. He doesn't grin. He just nods once, like this was always the outcome. Because in Bumpy's world, respect isn't requested. It's set. Luciano reaches his hand across. Bumpy stands. They shake. And if you're watching closely, you'd miss the real moment. Not the handshake. The real moment is what happens behind Luciano's eyes. He's calculating. Because he realizes this wasn't just a Harlem negotiation. This was a warning. Not, I can kill you, but you can't control what you don't belong to. Luciano releases Bumpy's hand. He stands. And when the boss stands, everyone else finally breathes. The meeting ends. No shots fired. No blood spilled. But the Mafia backed down in the only way that matters. They accepted boundaries. People love to remember gangsters as violent. But the truth? The smartest ones weren't the loudest. The smartest ones built systems. And systems create rules. That day, one rule became sacred. No soldiers in Harlem. Not to collect. Not to intimidate. Not to patrol. Because if Harlem ever saw Italian guns as owners, Harlem would fight forever. So the Mafia didn't own Harlem. They did business near it. They benefited from it. But they didn't invade it. And lucky Luciano left America days later, deported in February 1946. That's the real reason this story lives, because it isn't about a shootout. It's about something rarer, A gangster saying no to a bigger gangster and walking out alive. And whether every detail happened exactly like this, or whether Harlem polished it into legend, the lesson is still real. Power isn't about who pulls first, it's about who doesn't have to. If this story hit you, hit like. And if you're not subscribed, fix that, because these Harlem power stories drop constantly. Now comment this. If you were Bumpy, would you stay seated? Because the next episode, we're talking about what happens when Harlem doesn't go loud. When Harlem goes quiet and whole empire starts sweating.